All right, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. I'm not sure exactly when I'm going to upload this video. It's going to be like a precursor of sorts because I'm going to go ahead and drop this one. And then after this, I'm going to release or upload my DNA personal results journey from that. So, but this video right here actually is called Genetics and Genealogy: Establishing the Bloodline. I kind of felt it was important to kind of lay the groundwork for a lot of what I'm about to do with a lot of my videos, and I even have a Facebook community to coincide with this YouTube channel. So I like to kind of be thorough and cross all the T's and dot all the I's. So it's kind of important to get that established as far as what it means. And I hear a lot of people talking about lineage and genealogy, but no one has really touched on what I'm talking about, and that's really the science of geneticism and DNA, like what that means and how important that is to establishing genealogy, lineage, and the bloodline. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Again, the name of this particular video is entitled Genetics and Genealogy: Establishing the Bloodline. All right, I'm going to try to keep this as simple as possible without getting too scientific or too complex with the verbiage, as to not get confusing to the novice of genetics and DNA and all the different parts and pieces that help make it what it is. All right. Now, genetics and genealogy are synonymous because they both essentially involve the study and tracing of one's ancestral makeup, ancestry, to include geographical, nationality, etc., as well as their physiological makeup, connected by the root word gene. A gene governed by DNA, which is short for deoxyribonucleic acid, and the little known, rarely talked about RNA, ribonucleic acid. Genes hold the information to build and maintain an organism's cells and pass genetic traits to offspring. Every single living organism has genes corresponding to various biological traits, some of which are immediately recognizable, such as eye color and nose shape, etc. And some are not recognizable to the naked eye at all, like blood type, increased risk for certain diseases, or the thousands of basic biochemical processes that make up life. The word gene itself is actually derived from the Greek word genesis, meaning birth, or genos, meaning origin. Kind of gives a whole new meaning to Genesis in the Bible that starts off with in the beginning, right? Right. Now, how is a person's bloodline in genealogy established? Now, in genetics, with DNA, to be able to trace your lineage, you have to go through your biological father. And God made it that way. He established that. So anybody trying to use a different process, trying to say that, you have to establish lineage through the mother, they're not operating in the right spirit, and clearly they have a hidden agenda. But, we'll kind of get with all that later. But God established this in the book of Genesis, chapter 5, starting with Adam, the very first man. All right? Especially with male children now, because the father possesses what is called Y DNA or Y chromosome that he passes on to that male child. And he got his Y DNA from his father, and his father got it from his father, and so on and so forth. This goes back for like generations upon generations and thousands of years, man. So now if you were raised by a man, not your biological father, as admirable as that may be, it does not in any way help you trace your genealogy and lineage in helping you establish your actual bloodline. Y DNA haplotypes and haplogroups are a sequence of letters and numbers that represent the male origin and bloodlines of the different races. For example, majority of so-called African Americans belong to the E DNA group, or commonly referred to as E1B1A. Now, there's a lot of speculation, misconceptions, and outright lies about where this haplogroup originated and what does it denote in terms of race or national origin. So hopefully, when it's all said and done, I will put all the lies and the false information to rest with a series of very informative videos using not only scripture, but science, along with the DNA data of several different groups, what it says about that group, and what it means. Now, there are a lot of subgroups of the E1B1A, like E1B1A7A, and many other subgroups, which essentially means that we all come from the same seed or the same bloodline. So everybody under the E group, you can pretty much guarantee with 99.99% accuracy that we all come from the same seed and bloodline. Now, think of it more like this, like a big tree, right? With all the different subgroups. You have a big tree, you have several branches that grow from that tree, right? Well, with the several branches, even though they're growing in separate directions from that one tree, but they all came from the same tree. That's kind of like how an E group works. All right. Now, our DNA can actually be traced back to the time of Moses. And we know that because they've been able to extract DNA from ancient bones and mummies and stuff like that. And we're able to assign them to different haplogroups. Right. So now if a female child is born, she has in genetics what's called mitochondrial DNA. Now, there is a mitochondrial version of the male's Y DNA haplotype, but you have to actually ask a company specifically for that because a lot of companies aren't set up to test a female for their mitochondrial version of the Y DNA haplotype group. But it does exist. But the minute a male child is conceived, his Y DNA is what and whoever his father is. Period. Well before science got hip to just how crucial and important a person's DNA was, God established this science in the book of Genesis, like I said, chapter 5, starting with Adam. Then it goes into who begat who. You know, so what I'm saying about this whole science and DNA thing, look, the Bible said there's nothing new under the sun. Okay? And I don't know who came up with this idea that somehow science and the Bible are separate, because that's nonsense, man. Man came up with this idea that science and the Bible was separate because they simply don't believe in God. I mean, it's as simple as that. So they don't want to give an unseen entity any props for creating something because they don't believe in God. And you have a lot of so-called Christians and other Hebrew Israelites and things like that who's trying to echo the same thing. That's just not true. Because, well, way before science tried to tell us what was created first as far as the plant life and the trees and all that kind of stuff, and God already did all that. He told you what was created, and he set up the whole Y DNA sequencing with Adam and who begat who, so we could find out and know who came from who and who's the father of who. So God established it. I'm not saying nothing new or injected nothing profound that he hasn't already done. Okay, so we could just kind of kill that right there, And so he established that whole DNA sequence and what we call a Y DNA sequencing and Y, DNA, genealogy. He established that, right? Me personally, I tend to look at DNA as God's genetic mathematics, kind of like how no two people have the same exact fingerprints. DNA does the same fascinating thing. It gives us uniqueness, and not only to you, but all of our ancestors and where they came from. In a nutshell, DNA separates fact from fiction. And there's no denying the truth that DNA reveals. No matter how much some people don't want to accept it, ironically, this is exactly why some people are afraid to take a DNA test. Because something they've been told or taught their whole life could turn out to be a complete lie. Imagine that. I'm glad I'm not one of those people, though. I'd much rather be hurt with the truth than comforted with the lie any day. So, your son's father could be the worst dad in the world. Deadbeat, no good, and any other colorful name and adjective you could think of. But at the end of the day, nothing you do with respect to his male son, even giving him a different last name, keeping him away from him, whatever, nothing will change or take away from the fact that your son's birthright and lineage goes through that man, which is his father. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Doesn't even matter if you were married or not. Right? All of those things we've traditionally accepted as a society, like, a child not being given the last name of the father if he's not married to the mother. Man, that's a societal thing, not a biblical one. And truthfully, again, has nothing to do with genetically established lineage in a person's genealogy. Now, there's a lot of brothers out there who get terrified when you mention DNA. I think they get scared more of DNA than they do the IRS, to keep it all real. Or when you start talking about getting your DNA tested, they start bringing up all kinds of excuses and all this and that. I don't trust no white man. All that, man's a bunch of crap. Let me tell you something, man. Science is science. All right? And DNA is just like, it's the fact revealer. You can't deny DNA, man. I mean, it's in our blood, But I'm also here to tell each and every one of you, trust me, it's not what you've been thinking, man. And everything isn't always what it seems. Right? I thank God for the revelation of being entrusted, entrusting me and sending me to take this thing to the next level as a nation. Who you are and where your ancestors really came from, it's in your blood, and God made it that way on purpose. So, ain't no need to be, afraid of the DNA test and making up all these excuses and this and that. Because actually, our DNA backs up what the Bible says about you. All right? And I have the information and the knowledge to impart to each of you who has ears and want to hear and receive what I'm saying. Because my heart is pure, man. All right? So you don't have to be afraid of DNA no more, man. It's a whole new day now. It's a whole nother level. And I'm taking it there. All right? And real quick, I heard a brother say in one of the videos, the brother actually reminded me a lot of myself, because throughout my travels and on my path of enlightenment, I went through a lot of phases to get to where I am today in this truth. A lot of phases. This brother reminded me a lot of me. I don't remember his name, but he made a statement to the effect of, he said that that there's no way that Hebrews cohabitated in Egypt for all those hundreds of years and not be essentially polluted, with Egyptian blood. All right, and let me school you. I'm going to use that as a teaching moment. All right, that's not how it works in genetics and DNA. All right, I want to tell that brother, the Hebrews could have lived among the Egyptians for 1,000,000 years. But if the Egyptians impregnated a Hebrew woman, that child is going to take on the bloodline of that Egyptian. You see what I'm saying? So it doesn't matter if the mom is Hebrew. The fact is, if the father was Egyptian, that male child is going to take on his bloodline. So, there it is there. That's how it works in genetics and science. So there's really no argument there scientifically. All right? So, we're going to move right along. I'm going to tackle this whole last name thing. Now, last names or surnames in the beginning of time didn't exist. If you were a female child back in the biblical days, you were given a female name. That was pretty much that. If you were a male child, 9 times out of 10, you were given a name. And if someone else that was a male had that same name, they distinguished one by calling them, for example, Mark, son of Joseph, something along those lines. But surnames apparently meant very little because, again, God had already established what we call the Y DNA genealogy with the male line. He already established that. From being able to tell who was who and from whom and whence they came through the male, right? So the use of last names started actually in Western countries at about the turn of the last millennium, 1,000 years ago. As the population continued to increase, it became more difficult for banks and places of business and commerce to know who owed money to whom. For example, if Peter did in fact owe Paul then it became increasingly important to know which Peter owed which Paul. So last names started being used, indicating which Peter was which and which Paul was which. Now, middle names were actually introduced by German nobility sometime in the early 15th century, but didn't become common until the 1700s. All right? Middle names didn't take off and become common in America until after the Revolutionary War. Now, if you are so-called African American and your ancestors were brought to America via the transatlantic slave trade, as did the majority of our ancestors, you need to listen to what I'm about to say carefully. Now, I know this is going to still, come as a shock to some, but your last name, which I see a lot of people having a lot of pride about their name. I saw an interview one time with Chris Bosh, got offended because somebody said something about his last name, Bosh, and all this and that, had the audacity to be offended. But, whatever. If you are a byproduct of the transatlantic slave trade, your last name has absolutely nothing to do with your lineage, genealogy, bloodline, or anything relating to who you are genetically or where your ancestors came from. And truthfully, there's no pride in that. Now, unless you are the ancestor of a former slave master, tracing their last name to his country of origin does absolutely nothing for understanding who you are and where you actually came from. As a matter of fact, if you trace your last name and there's no genetic DNA or connection, you'll run across a whole bunch of people who's no more actually related to you than the man in the moon. Now, let me explain a little bit more in depth. All right? Up until when Lincoln so-called freed the slaves, slaves weren't even given nor went by last names at all. They were given first names, and that was it. Once the slaves were freed, some of them literally just randomly chose a last name. Essentially starting the last name lineage for here in America. That's about it. And some just chose the last name of their former slave master. It was easier because that's who they were with all this time. So they just stuck with that. So, actually it's a huge misconception that your last name was given by the slave master. Because truthfully, like I said, when Lincoln so-called freed the slaves, they pretty much chose their own last name. All right, no particular meaning or nothing. It's kind of like drawing straws, man. And see, so that's one of the main reasons last names weren't given back in those times, because names can be chosen at random or changed to whatever somebody wants to change it to. But your DNA cannot be changed by any circumstance. And that's God's way of knowing and letting us know who is who, where we came from, and who's our forefathers and who's our ancestors. So many times, and even now, children are given last names that have absolutely nothing to do with their actual birth lineage, man. And doesn't establish their bloodline. So to you ladies out there, whether you give them the father's last name or not, it still doesn't change that male child is who and what the daddy is. Period. Now, the importance of DNA. It's extremely difficult to either turn on the television, read a newspaper, magazine, or go through your news feed on Facebook and not read how DNA has either exonerated someone who's been in prison for a long time for a crime that their DNA proves conclusively they did not and could not have committed. DNA can completely exonerate, totally exclude, or convict someone conclusively. Now let that sink in for a minute. So you mean to tell me our DNA genetic profile is so unique and exclusive to us individually that it could exonerate you of a crime that so-called lawyers, doctors, specialists, and professionals couldn't? Fascinating, man. In more ways than one. But see, that's where we are with science and DNA. And that's why when they list our haplogroup of E1B1A as having been there at the start of the ancient Israel nation, quote unquote, in small amounts. See, I know what that's about. See, they would love to keep our origin as sub-Saharan and West African, right? But here's the thing. That's just not our truth, though. At least not the complete truth. You know, West Africa is essentially a subculture for us. Listen, civilization started in Africa. It's not about dissing Africa or not claiming Africa. It's about claiming our rightful nationality. Okay, because quiet as it's kept, Israel is in Africa, but it's in the Middle East of Africa. Anyways, enough about that. Moving right along. I'll get into all that later. But the fact that they do admit our DNA was there at the start of the ancient Israelite civilization tells me our people was totally included in Israel. And we all know, like the court of law and DNA, your DNA can prove that you was there or you wasn't, or it was somebody else. And the E1B1A was there at the start of the ancient Israelite nation. And that's a genetic fact. So, moving right along, you know, DNA is so incredible, man. I mean, it's like somebody could have been lying to you for years or lying to you for your entire life, you know, not bothering to tell you you were adopted, right? But your DNA reveals that's exactly what you are, because you have no biological or genetic data from the person or persons who raised you. Your DNA shuts down any and all lies you thought was the truth. There's no denying the truth of what DNA reveals. Many times it's the big aha, I knew it. And sometimes it reveals things people don't want to accept for whatever reason. But my thing is this. At the end of the day, God made us who we are. Far be it from us to not want to accept whatever and whoever he created us to be. I'm going to end this video right now, you know, but I am excited and look forward to bringing you all many more informative videos in the near future. Definitely. Now, next up, the next video is going to be, I'm going to reveal the results of my DNA and the journey it took me on to uncovering the truth and discovering me. And I want to thank you all for watching. And please hit like and subscribe.